The Tom Daniel Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniel Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniel Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. You know, from time to time on this show, I like to group a set of episodes together under a single idea. Now, you've heard me do that before with the Tangled Roots series, where I dig into my own family tree and uncover stories that are, strange, complicated, and absolutely real. Those stories remind us that the past is never as simple as we'd like it to be. Well, I'd like to introduce a new series that operates under a very similar principle, but instead of tracing family bloodlines, I'm going to trace sound and acoustics. And this series is going to be called The Mysteries of Sound. Now, when I say mystery, I don't mean ghosts or unexplained supernatural phenomena. I've got a different podcast for that called Requiem Radio. No, I mean questions that sit right in front of us, inside the music we hear every day, that we assume have already been answered, but haven't. These aren't fringe questions. They're central questions, like what did Bach actually sound like in his lifetime? Why do certain melodies get stuck in your head? Why does recorded sound feel different than live sound? And why does a building change the way music sounds? And perhaps most provocatively, how much of what we hear is shaped not by physics, but by belief? Each episode in this series takes one of those questions and treats it seriously, not as trivia, not as folklore, but as a problem worth thinking through. And the goal is not to solve the mysteries of sound. The goal is to understand why they're mysteries in the first place. And once you hear them that way, you won't listen to music the same way again. So let's start off with a topic that's been debated for decades, tested in laboratories, argued by musicians, and still refuses to go away. Today, I want to talk about one of the most famous objects in the history of music. Not a song, not a composer, not even a tune. A piece of wood. Well, actually several pieces of wood glued together very carefully by a man who's been dead for more than 300 years. We're talking about the Stradivarius violin. You've heard the name. Even if you don't know a thing about classical music, you know that Stradivarius is shorthand for the best, the gold standard, the Rolls Royce, the don't you touch that of musical instruments. Some Stradivariuses have sold for more than $15 million. Others are owned by banks, hedge funds, and foundations, and then loaned out to musicians the way museums loan paintings, with lots of paperwork, insurance policies, and a lot of nervous sweating. And yet, here's the weird part. After centuries of obsession, after scientific testing, after blind listening trials, after CT scans, laser measurements, and chemical analysis, we still cannot agree on a basic question. Do Stradivarius violins actually sound better, or do we just believe they do? That's today's episode. I want to start with something I remember seeing on television years ago. Hopefully you saw it too, so I know that my brain didn't exaggerate it. It was a little acoustical science experiment. A thin plate of violin wood sits on a table. Someone sprinkles fine iron filings across the surface. Then a low tone begins to vibrate the wood. Now, at first, the filings just kind of twitch and bounce around, and then slowly, they actually start to move. They slide away from some areas and collect along others, forming delicate curving lines. And those lines look suspiciously familiar. They resemble the shape and placement of the violin's F-holes. Now, let's pause right there because television loves to lie by omission. The filings do not form a perfect little F-hole stencil like the violin is whispering its own blueprint from beyond the grave. This is not a supernatural woodworking documentary. What's actually happening is a lot more interesting. And this phenomenon goes back to an 18th century physicist named Ernest Chladni, who discovered that when a thin plate vibrates, it doesn't vibrate evenly. Some areas vibrate a lot, and some hardly at all. The still areas are called nodal lines, and when you sprinkle fine particles on a vibrating surface, those particles migrate to the quiet places, the places where the wood is not vibrating much. So what those iron filings are really showing you is a map of vibrational behavior. And here's the key insight. The F-holes on a violin are placed where the instrument can afford to lose wood without destroying the vibration. They're not decorative. They're pressure valves. They allow the top plate to flex. They let the instrument breathe. In other words, the violin already knows where it wants to vibrate long before anybody ever cut the hole. And that's not mysticism. That's just pure physics. And now we can finally introduce the man himself. Antonio Stradivari did not own a spectrum analyzer. He didn't calculate resonant frequencies. He didn't sprinkle iron filings on a single thing. What he did was tap, flex, scrape, listen, remove a little wood, listen again. Over decades, over hundreds of instruments. A person who builds violins is called a luthier. Stradivari worked inside the laws of acoustics without naming them. He shaped wood until it behaved the way his ear told him that it should. The placement of the F-holes, the arching of the plates, the thickness of the wood, all of it reflects an empirical understanding of vibration discovered through touch and repetition. So yeah, there is real acoustic intelligence in these instruments. That part's not up for debate. Now, over the past few decades, researchers have conducted blind listening tests, double-blind tests, professional violinists, old violins, new violins, no labels, no price tags, no mythology allowed in the room. And in case you have questions, they weren't young ears versus old ears. They were professional ears. And age turned out not to be the deciding factor. And the results are a little inconvenient. Time and again, players fail to reliably identify Stradivarius violins by sound alone. Sometimes they prefer the modern instrument. Sometimes they guess wrong. Sometimes they swear they know, but they don't. Now, this is where people kind of panic and think science is trying to cancel out Stradivari. It's not, because something else shows up in those tests too. Players often describe Stradivarius violins as behaving different, responding differently, projecting differently. They behave in ways that aren't obvious under the ear, but they matter in a recital hall. The experience is subtle, physical, and deeply personal, and that is where the real mystery lives. Sound does not exist independently of the listener. Now, I'm going to say that again because it's the quiet thesis of this entire episode. Sound does not exist independently of the listener. Your brain does a lot of work before you ever decide what something sounds like. Expectation shapes attention. Attention shapes perception, and perception shapes judgment. If you believe the violin under your jaw is worth $15 million, you don't hear it the same way. You listen a little harder. You forgive a little more. You assign intention to response. You're not lying to yourself. You're being human. Wine tastes better when we think it's expensive. Paintings feel more powerful when we know who painted them. Voices sound more authoritative when we recognize them. Why would sound be any different? This doesn't mean Stradivarius violins are fake, overrated, or imaginary. It means that belief is part of the instrument. And that's a harder truth than either side really wants. Now let's talk briefly about money, because that matters, not acoustically, but culturally. When a violin sells for $10 or $15 million, it stops being just a musical instrument and becomes an artifact, a symbol, a financial asset. Its value reinforces the story, and the story reinforces the value. At that point, we're no longer just hearing sound. We're hearing history, prestige, scarcity, survival. You don't argue with something that's outlived empires and still fills a concert hall. Now, before I go any further, I need to explain something. You've been hearing me say Stradivari, and you've been hearing me say Stradivarius. What's up with that? Well, the man who built them was named Antonio Stradivari. But the label that he affixed to the instruments he built reads Stradivarius, because that's a Latinized spelling of his name. Apparently that was a thing back then in Italy. I don't know, connection to the Roman Empire or something, but the man was named Stradivari. The instruments are Stradivarius. And I guess technically it should be Stradivarius, but I'm an American, so I'm going to say Stradivarius. Okay, here's something else. Antonio Stradivari did not work alone in some isolated genius bubble crafting perfect instruments while the rest of the world fumbled around in the dark. He was part of a tradition, and not just any tradition, but one of the most concentrated bursts of craftsmanship that the musical world has ever seen. Let's go to Cremona, Italy, in the late 1600s. It's not a large city. It's not Paris. It's not Vienna. But for a period of about a century, it became the center of violin making in the entire world. And in that small place, at roughly the same time, there are multiple luthiers producing instruments that even today are considered among the finest ever built. Stradivari is just one of them. He's not the only one. Before him, there was Niccolo Amati, the great teacher figure. His instruments are known for their elegance, their balance, and kind of sweetness that players still chase today. If Stradivari represents expansion, power, and projection, Amati represents refinement, control, a kind of musical restraint. And it's very likely that Stradivari learned from Amati, whether formally or as a student or informally as part of the same workshop culture. And then, almost overlapping with Stradivari, you get Guarneri, Giuseppe Guarneri. If Stradivari is the polished master, Guarneri is something else entirely. His instruments look rough. They're not symmetrical. They're less perfect in the visual sense. But the sound? Darker, deeper, more aggressive, capable of cutting through an orchestra with a kind of raw authority. Some of the greatest violinists in history have preferred Guarneri over Stradivari, not as a compromise, but as a deliberate choice. Niccolo Paganini, one of the most formidable virtuosos who ever lived, played a Guarneri. And he didn't do that by accident. So now the story's already more complicated. Because if another maker working in the same region at roughly the same time can produce instruments that rival or even surpass Stradivari in certain hands, then whatever we're dealing with here is not a secret. And it doesn't even stop there. There's also Carlo Bergonzi, often described as the last great Cremonese master after Stradivari. His instruments are extraordinarily rare, but when they appear, they're treated with the same level of reverence. And before anybody writes in, there's also a Carlo Bergonzi who sang opera in the 1930s. Different guy, but just same name. One performed the music, the other built the machines that made it possible. There's also Giovanni Battista Guadagnini, working slightly later, whose violins are still used by top performers today. not as museum pieces, but as working instruments. And then if we step outside of Italy, the picture expands even further. In Austria, there's Jakob Steiner, who, before Stradivari became the dominant name, was actually considered the finest violin maker in Europe. His instruments were prized for their sweetness and clarity, especially in the Baroque period. In France, there's Jean-Baptiste Villon, a master craftsman and, interestingly, a master copyist. His reproductions of Stradivari and Guarneri instruments were so precise that even experts have been fooled by them. And that ought to make you pause, because if a 19th century maker can build something so close to a Stradivarius that it can pass for one, and we're no longer dealing with an unrepeatable miracle. We're dealing with something that can be understood, at least in part. And that brings us to the present, because this tradition did not end in the 1700s. There are modern luthiers living, working today, whose instruments are played by professionals at the highest level. Makers like Sam Zygmuntovich, Joseph Curtin, and Greg Alf have built violins that have been tested blind, without labels, against Stradivari instruments. And in some of those tests, players cannot tell the difference. In some cases, they even prefer the modern instrument. Now, that doesn't mean Stradivari is a myth. It just means something more interesting. It means he's part of a lineage of extraordinary craftsmanship, one that reached a remarkable height in Cremona, Italy, and that we still haven't completely decoded. But if multiple makers reach that level, and modern makers can sometimes reach it, then the mystery isn't whether great violins can be made. We know they can. The mystery is why one name, Stradivari, rose above all the others in the cultural imagination, and why even now, when we have the tools, the data, and the craftsmanship, we still hesitate to believe that anyone could truly match a Stradivarius. You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show. We'll be right back.
What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.
And welcome back to the Tom Daniels Show. And only Mary Mac could play so well, you'd think you were hearing a Stradivarius. Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. Now, we've been talking about the Stradivarius violin, and here's a question that sounds obvious till you actually think about it. Were any of these great violin makers actually violinists? I mean, you'd think the answer would be yes, of course they were. How else could they possibly know what a great instrument should sound like? Except that's not really how this works. Most luthiers, then and now, are not performers. I mean, they're not touring soloists. They're not out there playing Paganini caprices for fun. What they are is something else. They are listeners. They can pick up a violin, play a few notes, and tell you immediately how it responds, where it resists, what it wants to do. They're not asking, can I play on this? They're asking, what's this instrument capable of? That's a different kind of intelligence. As for the Cremona masters, Stradivari, Amati, Guarneri, we don't have strong evidence that any of them were high-level performing musicians. I mean, they lived in musical culture, they worked with players, they heard instruments constantly, but their genius wasn't performance. It was understanding how a piece of wood becomes a musical partner. And that's definitely a different skill. But in this case, it may have been the more important one. So here's another perfectly reasonable question. Okay, fine, we've studied these instruments for 300 years, we've scanned them, measured them, analyzed them, obsessed over them. Why can't a modern luthier just, copy one? And that's a fair question. And on the surface, it seems like the kind of problem we should have solved like around 1987 or something. You take a Stradivarius, scan it, measure it, map it, rebuild it. Problem solved, right? Except not quite. Because here's the part nobody tells you. Modern luthiers can copy almost everything. They can replicate the shape of the body down to fractions of a millimeter. They can match the arching of the plates. They can place the F-holes in exactly the same position, at exactly the same angle. They can even reproduce the thickness of the wood across the entire instrument using detailed graduation maps. We have CT scans of Stradivari violins. We have chemical analyses of the varnish. We have all kinds of stuff that can tell us where and roughly when the tree was cut. If this were a blueprint problem, it would already be solved. And yet the question persists. What's missing? Well, a few things. First, time. A Stradivarius violin is not just a design. It's a process that's been unfolding for 300 years. Wood changes over time. Internal structures break down very slightly. The way the instrument vibrates evolves. We can build a new violin. What we cannot do is convincingly build a 300-year-old violin. And then second, there's sensitivity. Violins are extraordinarily responsive systems. Tiny differences in stiffness, density, or thickness, differences you could barely measure, can produce noticeable changes in how the instrument behaves. Two violins can look identical on paper and still feel completely different under the bow. This is not failure, that's just complexity. And third, this is the one that matters the most, the player. A violin's not a finished object, it's a conversation. The player adjusts constantly. Bow speed, pressure, angle, contact point. The instrument responds, the player adapts again. That feedback loop is where the tone actually lives. And some instruments, Stradivarius among them, are often described as being unusually responsive. Not louder, not necessarily better in a simple sense, but just more interactive. They give the player more information to work with. And that's hard to measure in a laboratory. And then finally, context. When you pick up a Stradivarius, you're not just picking up a violin, you're picking up an object that has survived centuries, passed through the hands of great players, and accumulated a reputation that borders on myth. And that's important, not because musicians are gullible, but because musicians are human. Expectation shapes attention, attention shapes perception, perception shapes judgment. So when we ask why modern luthiers can't match Stradivari, we're asking the wrong question. The better question is this: what exactly are we trying to match? Because if the answer is just shape, material, structure, measurable acoustics, then the truth is, yeah, we can already do that. But if the answer includes time, experience, responsiveness, and the quiet weight of belief, then we're not talking about a blueprint anymore. We're talking about something bigger, something that doesn't live entirely in the wood. And speaking of wood, here's a story you might have heard, and it's a pretty good one too. It goes something like this. Stradivari lived during a mini ice age. The cold slowed tree growth. The wood became unusually dense and uniform. And that's why his violins sound better. Problem solved. It's neat, it's tidy, sounds like science. And like most good stories, it's only partly true. Yeah, there was a period known as the Little Ice Age. Europe experienced cooler temperatures, longer winters, and slower growing forests. And yes, slower growth can produce wood with narrower rings and more consistent density. That's real. And when researchers have examined some Stradivari instruments, they've found wood that does appear to have grown under those kinds of conditions. I mean, so far so good. But here's where the story kind of drifts a little bit. The trees didn't disappear. Stradivari wasn't forced to use some strange substitute material. and he wasn't working with a species of wood that no longer exists. I mean, he used spruce and maple, the same woods violin makers still use today. And modern luthiers can still obtain wood with very similar characteristics. So the idea that Stradivari had access to some lost magical forest that we can never recover, well, that doesn't hold up. What's more likely is this. He had access to very good material, possibly helped along by a cooler climate, and then he did everything else right. But here's the thing. Other makers in the same region using similar wood do not all receive the same level of reverence. And modern instruments made from carefully selected slow-growth wood can still compete quite well in blind tests. So the little mini Ice Age wood theory doesn't solve the mystery. It just makes the mystery a little bit more comfortable. It gives us a single cause, a historical movement, a reason to say, well, they had something we don't have anymore. And, we kind of like that, because it's much easier to believe that greatness came from a special tree than from a level of craftsmanship and sensitivity that we can measure, imitate, and still not fully explain. So what is the Stradivarius question really? It's not, are they better? That question's too small. The real question is, how much of what we hear is in the wood and how much is in us? Those iron filings on the vibrating plate show us something real. The physics is not imaginary, the craftsmanship is not hype, but meaning happens later, between vibration and interpretation, between ear and expectation, between sound and belief. That's where the legend lives. A Stradivarius violin vibrates according to physics. It breathes according to design. It responds according to craft. But what we hear, what we decide we hear, is shaped by memory, culture, history, and belief. If a Stradivarius had no label at all, no auction record, no whispered reverence attached to its name, would it sound the same? Well, physically, yes. Experientially, probably not. And that uneasy gap between what vibrates and what we believe is why the Stradivarius question refuses to die. This has been the Tom Daniels Show. And just as a reminder, I publish essays at my Substack site called the Academy of Southern Music, with new essays every Tuesday. I also publish another podcast called Requiem Radio, where music bleeds into the supernatural, with new episodes every Friday. Keep listening and keep learning.
Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Take a break from your usual routine and tune into the Tom Daniels Show. You'll discover the world of melodies and stories that you might not know. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.